final panel. It's a lot of star power here.
Can the
Professor
star
Louis
power work the
Warren from the
microphone?
History Department, Professor John Hull from Sociology, and Professor Rob Feenstra from Economics. Louis is starting.
Well, I'm trying to start. I have to, I can manage the PowerPoint okay, but it's the microphones that get me every time. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. I'm going to talk about the problem of rising tuition and who's responsible for it, and a little bit about how it happens, but mostly about what my suggestions and suggestions of the people around me have been about how it might be dealt with. Let me start, though, with a letter to the editor that appeared in the Davis Enterprise on Sunday. Don't read the whole thing because your blood will boil over. But it starts out, as a UC Davis alum and former resident of Davis, I'm shocked and infuriated by the events of the past week. The students involved in the demonstrations, scare quotes, are the epitome of what is wrong with America today. I would just call your attention to the last line that I bolded, not the last line, but the bolded line at the bottom. Why should the rest of society fund your education? I never asked anyone to fund mine. I worked. Now, I did some research on this individual. I haven't called him yet, but I know where he is, and you could find it all out as well. I didn't put his name up here because I didn't want to, it's not like I want to sick a whole pack of people on him or anything like that. But he apparently graduated from UC Davis as an undergrad in the 1980s, and he went to medical school in the early 90s. And he's done very well for himself, he says. And I believe him. The thing is, to get to the point, he did not pay for his education himself. The taxpayers of California paid the overwhelming majority of his bill. And the fact that he is so aggressively, self-righteously, indignantly ignorant about that fact is a big, big problem for any movement seeking to lower tuition in the UC system. And what I'm going to do here is give you some tools to answer challenges like this. Because you're going to have to persuade, if not this gentleman, then people like him to come around to your side. So how might you go about doing that? Well, let's start with who sets the fees in the University of California. It's the UC Regents. The UC Regents no longer look like this, but this was such a funny picture. I just couldn't help myself, and so I used it. Now, who are the Regents? They're the governing board of the UC system. It's written in the state constitution that the UC is to be managed as a public trust by a Board of Regents, who are responsible for managing, among other things, the finances and endowment of the university. They are appointed by the governor. They get a 12-year term. They get no salary. Right? They are, in essence, they along with the president whom they appoint, okay, they supervise what has become a 10-campus system. I am not going to pretend there are not lots of problems with the Regents and with the way that part of the system operates. But, there are problems of conflict of interest. There are loads of problems that come with this system. But they stand independent of the state legislature. They are not governed by the state legislature except in the loosest sense of the term. The state legislature doesn't have power over what goes on campuses except in the most removed kind of terms. So, for example, it's the regents who set policy around curriculum. The state legislature can't do that. The state legislature cannot get into the budget of the UC and say, we don't like this professor, we're going to defund her research. Right? They can't do that in the state legislature because the regents have the budgetary authority over the university. Now, what does this mean? It means that a lot of things, but it means these two institutions, the regents and the legislatures, often are opposed to one another. Very often. You'll find legislators trying to go after the UC Regents for one reason or another, and UC Regents resisting. One of the consequences of this, I'm not saying you should not protest against the Regents. I'm not saying that. But one of the consequences of this is a lot of state legislators love it when students go after the Regents, because it means you're not in their offices. All right? It means that they can tell the Regents, well, it looks like you got some problems down there on campus. That's really hard. Guess you got to deal with that. And then they can go after the regents and say, maybe we ought to have an investigative board. Maybe you should just give us some more budgetary authority over the university. There are these kinds of conflicts in which protests against the regents can actually play into the legislature's hands. Sometimes you might want that to happen, but sometimes maybe you don't. It's something you need to think about. All right? Now, if the regents manage the funds from the UC, where do those funds come from? Well, there's a $22 billion budget, almost, about $22 billion for the entire UC system. The orange part are what we call the core funds. That's the part that can be used to educate undergraduates. Right? Notice it comes, 13% comes from state general funds, 12% comes from the student fees. Those other colored parts of the graph, the medical centers, the government contracts and grants, that money cannot be used to educate undergraduates. Right? So the money to educate you all comes from your fees and from money the state legislature gives to the university. And how does that money get spent? It gets spent like this. It's mostly academic salaries and staff salaries, some benefits, student aid, financial aid. That's how that money gets spent. And it, in the past, has come overwhelmingly from the state. Now, why should the state give you, well, what I'm going to propose here is that the state should just give the university system more money and lower your fees. And that should be your demand. That's a suggestion. It's not my movement, it's your movement.
How about the regents' suggestion?
How about, excuse me?
The regents.
What about them?
I just got done telling Katay in front of all those people, the university ought to stand up and say, you need to do more taxes. This
Oh, absolutely. Sure. The regents should come right along and they should join you. Okay? And Sherry Lansing on the regent, she has said, let's do a march together, right? You can take that for whatever you want, however you want to take that. But the main point is the money and the power to raise taxes lies with the legislature. The regents come up with a budget. Actually, the president comes up with a budget. He gives it to the regents approve it or not. And they then take it over to the legislature and say, please, please, please give us this money. Okay? And the legislature says no. And they give some other amount of money, usually. All right? Now, here's the thing. If you want to lower the tuition, you need to go to the state legislature. Why should they lower it? Because that's the tradition. It wasn't until 1921. The university was founded in 1868. Not until 1921 did they charge any fees at all. They started charging fees for parking and health care, things that were unrelated to instruction. As late as 1957, it was $84 a year to go to the UC system. They built 9 campuses, 10 campuses. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, UC Davis, Santa Barbara, Irvine, Santa Cruz, UC San Diego, UC San Francisco. The greatest public institution of higher learning and research in the entire world, bar none. And it was practically free. It remained free for a very long time. And then all of this changed. Beginning about 1968, you can see it was $331. That's during Ronald Reagan's governorship. Reagan was the first governor to say students should pay for their education. The legislature took him up on it and began to demand that the students pay some fees. And you can see the fees increased. This is down to 2008. But they increased remarkably beginning in the early 1990s. And this is the graph I think you should pay most attention to. If there's one you can take away, it's this one. If you'll remember the graph earlier that Professor Rauschway showed you, it's in the early 90s that things really go to hell when it comes to your fees. And notice this graph here, the darker blue section is the money that comes from the state general funds to educate each undergraduate. And in 1990 and 91, the state paid $17,000 to educate each undergraduate. Today, they pay about $7,000 to educate each undergraduate. There are 180,000 undergraduates in the UC system. Now, let's put that UC education to work. 180,000 undergraduates times $10,000 apiece, which is the amount that your aid has been cut. How much money is that? 180,000 times 10,000? Anybody?
$1 billion on
1.8 billion dollars, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah.
That's what it would take to give you the same opportunity that the writer to the Enterprise had when he was at the UC. That's how much additional money it would take that would need to go back into the system. $1.8 billion. Notice also, there's just less money overall going into educating undergraduates. Because the regents, they've passed part of the bill back to you, right? You've made up part of the difference, but not all of it. Basically, the UC is spending less money to educate each undergraduate, bigger classes, fewer professors. It's lower quality, right? That's part of what's happening here. I'll finish here by saying that I've said that this should be, I think, your demand, right? And this is what I think I would say to I would suggest you say to people like the person who wrote the letter to the Enterprise, but also to the state legislature, who went to the UC and the CSU overwhelmingly in the 70s and 80s. They're all 45 to 65 years old, almost all of them, 45 to 65 years old. And all you're asking is for the same deal they had. You don't want to be special. What is a student? This is one of the common things we throw at student demonstrations. Oh, I want special things. I want to be special people. You don't want to be special. You're asking not to be special. Right? You're asking for what every generation of Californians since 1868 has had until now. And that is a quality public higher education that is paid for overwhelmingly by the state. What does the state get in return for that? Well, I think that what you can say is we'll work hard and pay taxes for education and other good things like Social Security checks, which, by the way, those 45 to 65-year-old state legislators are really worried about, right? That they know that if they leave the public uneducated, the public that comes after them, that public is going to make less money. And that merely compounds the problem of all the Medicare and Social Security they're supposed to get. Because in case you're unaware, those programs don't actually work by setting aside as investments the money that we pay in. They use the money that we pay in to pay for the people who are in the system now. Right? They need you to be educated. And part of what Professor Oropesa was saying earlier, that it is a disaster that Latinos in California and other populations are uneducated. That is categorically, I agree with her. What are some of the ways we can solve the problem of taxes or of the revenue problem for funding tuition? I would just say that California is an extraordinarily wealthy place. The 8th largest economy in the world, 11% of everything that the United States exports, 11% of its value comes from California. Right? California has a bigger economy than Canada, Russia, or Brazil. The people of California use more gasoline and diesel than any nation on earth except for the United States itself. And you're going to tell me they don't got money? There's money here, right? The top 0.2% of Californians, or 34,000 of them, paid over, they're people who made over $1 million in income last year, or the year before, or in a given year, right? They earned $104 billion in 2009. That's 2% of your 1.8 billion. Right? The money is there. How do you get to it? Well, the legislature will tell you, yeah, but there's a 2/3 requirement, a supermajority required to raise taxes. That's true. But the 2012 elections are the first elections to be held with the new legislative districts drawn on the basis of the 2010 census. And there's a very real possibility that Democrats could take both of those houses and with more than 2/3 of a majority if there's enough public involvement and activist involvement in getting those elections organized. And I would suggest to you that there lies a route for real structural change. What happened out here on the Quad was a signature moment and a watershed moment in many different ways. But it can change a lot of things here on campus. Right? You can force the resignation of the chancellor, you can move the cops off campus. I'm not going to make comments on any of those things. Lots of good things can and already have happened. But if it becomes a watershed moment that drives a movement that actually leads to some restoration of public funding to the UC, then you will actually have shaped the history of the greatest institution of public higher learning and research in the history of not just the United States, but the history of the world. And I'll just leave that to you. Thanks.
Well, folks, we've reached the point in the evening, I think, where most everything's been said, but not everybody said it yet. So I can be a little bit briefer than my colleagues.
Microphone? I need
Sure.
it for the tape.
You need it for the tape, okay. I can be a little bit briefer than my colleagues and the other people that have spoken here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I remember coming out to California when I first took a job here in 1989, and I stopped in my U-Haul rental truck at a motel in Utah, and there on the table of my motel room was an old issue of Time magazine. Cover said, "California, dream or nightmare?" We've reached the point where we kind of get to decide that. And so, I don't know why. Got fancy on myself. But what I want to talk about is some of the things that Louis has spoken to and add a little detail here and there and skip over the parts and try not to repeat them. But to begin with, I'll say that I started to become really passionately interested in this issue last year when Blake Stimpson, a colleague in Harks, and I put together a seminar that included faculty, students, and staff, a small number of people, but discussing public education, higher education at the crossroads. And we put up a smart site. It has a lot of resources on it about higher education, its funding. It has, I think, the original master plan that was put together in the 1960s. If you want it, you can email me at jrhall@UC and put crisis in the header. So people have no doubt run through the tuition increases that are happening, that have happened, 32% up to 10,000 in 2009 to 10. A projected, what you have to look forward to if the movement that we're all engaged in doesn't succeed is 82% increase over 4 years through 2015 to 2016, which would put tuition here, just tuition, not living expenses, at $23,900. Well, how did we get here? A number of people have talked about this in different ways. I'll start at the 1960s, the three-tier system, the community colleges, the California State University system, and University of California as a system of research universities as a three-tier system that was part of the master plan for higher education that made California what it has been until late in terms of higher education in the world. According to the master plan, admission to a UC campus was guaranteed for anyone graduating from a high school in California in the top 12.5% of their classes. And that is not completely an egalitarian approach in that it's the top students on the one hand, but it does open, because there are many high schools in diverse locations in California, it does open the system to a wide variety of students if the University of California is able to honor that commitment. As I understand it, the University of California no longer does honor that commitment. Tuition and fees, as Louis pointed out, have been very low. In 1968, they were $320. Proposition 13 is, if we look at how we got here, certainly one of the fault lines, one of the changes that upended the budget of the state of California, and by doing so, took resources away from the University of California. There's some good things about Prop 13, and certainly at the time, voters thought so, but they got more than they wanted. They got the cap on the rate of increase of property taxes, and property taxes were seriously threatening elderly people, retired people who couldn't keep up with the increase in the assessments of their property during boom times. But there were a lot of hidden elements to Prop 13. One was the 2/3 majority tax increase requirement that was put in place that made it basically an undemocratic system in terms of whether taxes can or cannot be raised. Another was that businesses benefited in hidden ways from evading taxes by acting as, quote, individuals and not selling their property, thereby capping the rate of assessment of business property that was going up at extremely rapid rates. There are a lot of other perverse things about Prop 13. Because people want to keep their property taxes low, people are less likely to sell their present house and move to another house in another location, even if that other house would be closer to their place of work. You can look at the California highway system and how clogged it is, in part as a result, a perverse result of Prop 13. Well, but even in 1990, tuition and fees were only $1,600. So let's look at the long term and see, well, where did things go wrong? I think you can see from this graph that in part it was indeed very low tuition through about 1975. Federal funding, which is the top line, remains fairly constant. State funding, which is the second from top line at this side of the graph, really begins to decline precipitously during Jerry Brown's first term as governor, when Proposition 13 was passed, goes truly down and then a bit up again during George Deukmejian's administration in the 1980s, begins to come back, and just at the point in 1989-1990 when I arrived at the University of California, California was struck by what we can call the Cold War end recession. That is, when the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the defense and aerospace industries in Southern California took a big hit, and California entered something of a recession. And that was the beginning of the time when this gradual decline in state funding happened. I won't belabor the point of the continued decreases in the 1990s through 2010. But if you look at tuition increases, again, as other people pointed out, it's really in the 1990s that it begins to pick up. But it's not, I don't think, fair to say that it's a result simply of the recession of the 1990s. It seems that if you look back a graph or two, let's see, where am I? That am I going backwards? Yeah, that it predated the recession itself slightly. It makes us think that it's more likely that it's part of a more general climate of anti-government spending, a philosophy, a neoconservative philosophy of shrinking government, of starving government, and that policy then gradually took its toll in the 1990s. The other thing that's important, and here's where fee costs really start to skyrocket. The other thing that's important to recognize is that when the three strikes and you're out proposition passed in California, it created a huge increase in demands for prison costs, and those demands began to eat away and crowd out and compete with the University of California for funds. So that, and I think people have said at this point that prison spending now has surpassed spending on higher education. So if we could just get some of the nonviolent offenders who happen to be ensconced in the prison system, out of the prison system, and into the educational system, we might be better off. All right. Well, the consequences are pretty clear, and I won't bother to reiterate them. But what then can we say about where to go from here? And I want to close by asking a simple question. And that question is whether you have, as citizens of California, a right to higher education. I want to frame this in a somewhat different way than other people have. I think the demands that Louis discussed are appropriate. But consider high school. Think about what high school has meant to this country and when high school really took off as something. How many people went to high school in 1900? Maybe 5% went to free public high schools, and they had to take an entrance examination. Sounds kind of similar to college in the 21st century. By the middle of the 1950s, about 80% of eligible individuals were attending high school. So you can see that over the course of the first part of the 20th century, high school changed from something that was an elite occupation, an elite opportunity, open to 5%. High school was something pretty much everybody did. Well, why was that the case? Well, it turns out that our society and our economy needed people with high school educations. And so we got people with high school educations, and they were public high schools that were free. Nobody's charged to go to high school in a public school in the United States. Well, the question then, I would say, that we should ask is whether college today is the high school of the 20th century. That is to say, whether for people who are qualified to get into college, college is a basic right, something that we need to have to be able to participate in an economy that is an economy driven often by technical, critical thinking, and higher education. If we can't have that, then we're selling ourselves short in a way that we weren't willing to sell ourselves short at the beginning of the 20th century and through the 20th century. So I have high hopes for the 21st century, but it takes getting us to the point where college education.
I'll also talk about tuition. I'll move along quickly, but I want to wake you up and get your participation too. So I have some questions. None of them are trick questions. So if an answer pops in your mind, just throw it out. So what's in-state tuition this year? 13,000? Is that what I heard? Around 13,000. Okay, who should we blame for that? Who would the Occupy Wall Street, you'll forgive me for paraphrasing them, who would the Occupy Wall Street movement say we should blame? The top 1%. Well, actually, there is some truth in that, right? A recent study investigated who's in the top 1%. It's not people in sports and entertainment, right? They're a tiny fraction of that. Significant fraction was CEOs, and a significant amount were chief financial officers, main people in banks who brought us the financial crisis of 2008. These people were selling assets on the one hand and betting against those assets, those very same assets on the other hand. Where should those people be? Those people should be in jail, right? Unfortunately, they are not. Those activities are not illegal in the United States. They should be. We have legislation slowly moving through the federal government to try and at least limit those activities. They should be in jail. They're not. Okay, what's the next thing, best thing an economist could do if they're not in jail? How about tax them? Okay, let's tax them. Who wants to tax people with incomes over $1 million right now? Who's proposed that? Oh yeah, you all want to do it. Yeah. Who's proposed it that could actually do it? Obama, right? Let's tax millionaires. He doesn't mean people with assets of $1 million. A lot of people have assets of $1 million, trust me. These are people with incomes of $1 million in a year. Let's put a special tax on them. That is totally reasonable. We ought to do it. It'll never happen unless Obama is reelected next year. Okay, so I just throw that out. What I know about Occupy Wall Street comes from my son, who's 23, and his friends who have spent time at encampments. And my son comes home and he says, there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. They've all failed us. Forget about it. Well, I can't argue with him, right? He'll out-argue me every time. But I want to at least try to suggest there is a difference, right? We elect the Democrats next year. We can start to raise that tax rate on the wealthiest people. We absolutely need to do that in this country. Okay, that's the federal government. Let's go to the state government. So you all said you want to tax millionaires. So if 51% of the people in California want to tax rich people, would it happen? No, why not? 2/3, you all got it, okay? You heard that from Professor Hall and Professor Warren. Just in case some of you don't know, Proposition 13 says you need a 2/3 majority for any tax increase. 2/3 majority in the state legislature. That is a failure of my generation to allow that to be enacted, or the generation slightly above me, but I'll take responsibility from that. It would be the greatest thing that the Occupy movement could do if you could chip away at that. I could never do that, right? If you can start a conversation that will chip away at Prop 13, a profoundly undemocratic piece of legislation, right, that could chip away at that, that would be tremendous, right? So I just leave that for you. Okay, that's the federal government. That's the state government. We can't stop there. We do actually have to look within, right, at the University of California. And there is a deep secret hidden in the University of California. I was at a meeting about a year ago on this campus, a financial meeting, talking about the money coming in and the money going out. I'm an economist. I like those discussions. I pay attention. And I saw a bit of a trend that I questioned the speaker on. She confirmed that the trend I saw was right. And that trend was up until 1 year ago, and remember, prior to that, tuition had gone up significantly, right? You know, all that increase in tuition up to 1 year ago, not one penny stayed on this campus. It all went to the office of the president, not to pay for executives. Sorry to say, it's not that simple. It went to pay for the retirement system of the University of California, which is bankrupt. The retirement system, which was started in the early 1960s, Professor Warren mentioned this briefly in referring to Social Security. It's not a system that saves to pay for people who are going to retirement. It takes current money to pay the people who are going to retire or already retired. Current money pays for retirement. Again, I'm not talking about retirement of the executives. I'm talking about 100% of the faculty and staff. This is not 1%, this is 100%. It is a bankrupt system because of bad decisions that were made in the 1960s when it was set up. It was never funded. It was an unfunded system. Take from current income, pay into retirement. That is a bit of a Ponzi scheme, right? It's not sustainable. It's not a real bad Ponzi scheme. I mean, if the university keeps growing at a modest rate, it can work. Well, that's not what happened after 2008. So we had the financial crisis of 2008, combined with a lopsided state budget, Prop 13 and so on, combined with a bankrupt financial system. These work together, right? The way the state is funded, Prop 13, and the UC retirement system exacerbate the problems of the 2008 crisis. That brings us to today. So sort of a perfect storm of events. None of this was anticipated. They should have been funding that retirement system for the last 50 years, right? And the problem today would be much less, much less. By my rough estimate, the problems that face, the financial difficulties that face the university and face you are about equally due to the lack of state funding and the need to fund the retirement system. These are about equal causes, in my view. Both of them exacerbated by the 2008 financial crisis. Okay, so if that's where we are, where can we go? Now let's turn the clock back a little bit before Friday the 18th, if you'll allow me. Let's go back a year or 2 years. Let's go back to the first weeks and the first month that our current chancellor arrived on campus. I attended some meetings she was at, some small gatherings, and what I heard her say is, the state money will never come back. We need to change the way we finance the university, and we only have two choices. The current situation is not sustainable. Either we have to shrink or we have to grow. And she, of course, is just talking about the Davis campus. Shrink or grow, shrink or grow. So as an economist, well, what do an economist say? Grow, grow. But that's the only answer, right? It's the only answer. Because our retirement system, the money that's needed for that is a fixed cost. It would not go away even if we educated 0 students. It's a fixed cost, right? It doesn't depend on how many students we're educating, which is what we're here for. The only way we can pay that retirement is to educate more people, collect more tuition, okay? That is the Chancellor's plan to grow, add 5,000 students by 2020. Some of those, by her calculation, would be out of state, right? She wants to have, of the 5,000 new students, she wants to have 3,000 out of state. At 30,000 a year, that's $90 million. Let's round it up to 100 million. It's not the 1.8 billion that Professor Warren referred to, but it's 100 million for this campus. That's big money. That would more than pay for the retirement system. That would allow tuitions to stabilize even if the state quit giving us money. So I just want to throw this out to you. I do think now that after the events of Friday the 18th, 11 days ago, I think there will be profoundly more voice for students on this campus. And one of the decisions you will be faced with is not whether to support the Chancellor per se. Let's put that aside. That's totally your own decision. But whether to allow this campus to grow, whether to allow more students on this campus, not all of whom would be within state, more students from the within state would come, okay? And more students from out of state. Whether you think that's a good idea for your future and for the future of this campus. Thank you.
Okay, so we can take a few minutes now for questions from the audience. Please, Rob.
So I'm definitely going to try to keep this a question, even though it's totally honest, it's something of a question comment. Professor from sociology, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Hi. You did mention really briefly the anti-government ethos that we've been experiencing the past couple of decades. And I'm just wondering, like, what do each of you think the usefulness is of talking more about that? Just basically the rise of the new right after the 1960s. And the fact that we have a whole bunch of little problems that create big problems here, little mistakes, right, that everyone's been pointing out. But isn't there also a bigger picture here of the entire attitude of the American public towards the public sector, what taxation means to a society? It seems to me that is such a huge problem that it needs to be talked about so much more. And one of the strengths of the Occupy movement is it's getting around that traditional rhetoric. So how important do you think that is? How useful is it to focus on really changing the way we think about, what sort of society we want to live in, what wealth distribution is about, or redistribution?
Well, I think that's one of the great benefits of the Occupy movement, the broader Occupy movement, is that it's putting the crisis of our institutions on the line. It's putting it front and center. And part of that, it's both that there has been a collapse in our institutions. When you have a Congress that can't act in the midst of the greatest economic calamity since the Great Depression, that's a real crisis of institutions. And understandably, after that, you have a crisis in faith in institutions. But the crisis in the faith in the institutions came long before that, and I think it was encouraged. Part of it is because Americans don't get much back for the taxes we pay because of the amount of our taxes that goes into military spending. You go to Europe and you see that people actually get benefits. They get education, they get parks, they get facilities for child care, on and on and on. They pay a lot of taxes. but they get things back, and at least until the economic crisis recently, and it's a good thing. So, yeah, I think that trying to, you know, you have to fix the institutions in order to have people have faith in the institutions. That's the key.
So I also completely agree that rhetoric is important. Top tax rate, income tax rate in the United States is 35%. It's lower than any other industrial country, extremely low, and yet taxes are a bad word. So somehow we have to change that.
I agree with all this, and I agree with much of the kind of statement that came with the question. I would just encourage you, though, to not, one of my frustrations is that there's a tremendous search for alternative ways of talking about things, when straight old-fashioned, straight-up debate and confrontation with the evidence seems to be have gone out of vogue. When we debated, such as it was, whether to let the Bush tax cuts expire in the United States Congress, I did not hear a single Democrat say, okay, we had a perfect laboratory experiment. We tried it for 10 years. It's failed. It's failed. Tried it for 10 years. It was supposed to generate all those jobs. How's that working out for you? How's that working out? It's supposed to generate a tremendous amount of wealth for the public. How's that working out? And it's not working out well. But I did not hear President Obama say that. Right? It's all about, oh, tax cuts generate revenue. Right? It's the failure of the Reagan conservative ideology is so profound that it's one of those historical moments where I think people have a hard time actually seeing it because it's the biggest elephant in the room.
Very bad.
Professor Warren, you showed us a slide that you said was very important that showed the percentage that state funds and tuition contributed to the cost of an undergraduate education. And you said that the cost of an undergraduate education was about $17,000. I'm sorry to report that your number is actually not that accurate because it's based on the UC's instruction and research portion of the budget. So what they do is they take the amount of undergrads and they take the instruction and research budgetary category and they calculate the cost of an undergraduate education based on that. And obviously that's not that accurate, but if you disaggregate instruction and research and base your number on solely the cost of instruction for undergraduates, the actual approximate cost for an undergraduate education is about $7,000. According to Charles Schwartz, who's at UC Berkeley, he's an emeritus professor who's been investigating this. So I think the argument that we should take this to Sacramento kind of falls apart when we see that the cost of tuition is already more than it costs to educate an undergraduate, and people like Mark Udoff are proposing an 81% tuition hike that would bring the tuition even higher.
I don't know Mr. Schwartz's research, so I can't comment on it. $7,000 for, he wants to disaggregate instruction from research. That's a pretty idea. That's cute, but what do you teach without research? Historians, if you don't research as a historian, we'd be teaching, let's see, 25 years ago, 30 years ago in textbooks, it wasn't unusual to find black people enjoyed slavery. Yeah? Women enjoyed being in the home. And research is what actually changed the teaching. Okay? So I don't think this idea of disaggregating the two is a very good idea. And my main point is just that the state, whatever they gave, has slashed the funding. And that is something that's unique to this generation. Since 1990, since about the time you guys were born, right? There has been a radical decrease in funding. So whatever the numbers you want to use are, that is the fact, that they've cut it by about $10,000 a student. And my take on that is that's a bad thing.
Yes.
I've got questions for you as well, Professor Warren. So in regards to your proposal or your recommendations for long-term focus of the UC movement, what would be some short-term recommendations for maintaining, well, specifically in the next 2 weeks and over winter break, for maintaining momentum and guiding the focus of the movement? Short-term recommendations.
Short-term recommendations for your movement, I'm not very good at that kind of thing. I'm a historian and I like to sit and read books and talk a lot. And, I've been so blown away by, on the one hand, the astonishing display of nonviolence in the face of brutality, which I watched on my computer at an oasis in the Atacama Desert with some Chileans, by the way, who were extraordinarily impressed. By the way, they're protesting tuition increases as well and occupying campuses. Very impressed with that. That on the one hand is extraordinary courage. On the other hand, the process that I saw at the General Assembly, I've never seen that before. So I'm not good at that kind of thing. I'm sorry. So I'm going to leave that to people who know better. But thanks.
I think one of the big arguments that we're going to have to address when we're trying to appeal to a really broad audience in California is the fact that I think a lot of people are going to say that it's really unfortunate that the state isn't funding education the way it used to, and it is unfortunate that students will have to take out larger and larger loans to pay for their education. But that, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, how are we going to deal with this argument? They're going to say that on the other hand, students will get a benefit in their future salaries that will outweigh that debt that they incur, and that it is ultimately acceptable that students will continue to go to college, we will continue to educate our children, it will be paid for in a different way, it will be paid for with student loans, and then people will pay it off, and things will continue pretty much the way they have, or that things will, continue to be good in California. And so how would you guys try to address the argument that it's acceptable for public education, higher education to largely be paid for out of student tuition?
Well, historians and sociologists have a term for people who are indebted and then forced to work off the debts. It's called debt peonage. And I suppose the question is whether we want to have a society that's based on debt peonage or not. The alternative is to see that education is not simply a private good, it's a public good. What you do when you go out as graduates of the University of California, on average, is to contribute to the greater good of our society. That's a public good. And it has long been recognized, as I took the example of high school, that education is a public good in that specific sense and not just something that you own as an individual. And the problem with debt peonage is that it skews the kinds of decisions that people make and the kinds of lives that people can live under that regime in ways that I suspect detract from the public good. That's just a guess. That if we want to have a society that is a society of peons, it's not going to be the great California of the California dream.
My main concern is I don't want it to get worse. And actually, we haven't seen the bottom yet, okay? So in order for this to not get worse on this campus, we need to take control of it on this campus, right, by restructuring this campus. There's a chance maybe we get something back from the state. I hope we do. But I do believe there's things we can do here to make sure it doesn't get worse.
Yes.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, a few things. With education, with all these, like the fact that they're going to raise tuition by 81% probably, like how are people supposed to pay this back? Like, we want this to be like a third economic bubble that's like speculative bubble that would be about to burst. And also with things going on in Europe, like how much worse do you think the recession is going to get?
So in 5 years, things will look better. That's my prediction, but it won't be much quicker than that. Okay, so it's going to be very slow. So your generation is the left out generation, right? You're going to school throughout the leftover of the financial crisis, okay? The 81%, that's, it was a proposal by UDOF to raise fees between 8 and 16, compound 16 over 4 years, you get 81. So that doesn't refer to everyone. It was punted on by the regents. I think this campus should delink itself from it. Just absolutely delink itself. The future of the campuses are to charge differential tuitions, right? That's not permitted right now by Office of the President. We don't choose tuition. That's the future. We should delink it, and we should make sure we don't charge that.
We'll have one more question. Yes.
So
So we talked a lot about tuition rises and how that goes into the UC budget, or UCD budget. How does like endowments work for legislators? Because I know there was a lot of talk that the chancellor wanted to increase our endowment to buffer against various, financial difficulties, pain, future pensions. If we have that endowment, we can use that, the interest on that, to pay for future pensions and so on. And I know a lot of private institutions have large endowments, and that certainly benefits them in some way, but we don't have that at all. Can you speak to that at all?
Repeat the question.
The question was, how about endowments, right? How's that work? My answer, I'm ready to sponsor a student, right? I mean, that's my response to Friday the 18th. I want to sponsor a student, right? We should have every alum of UC Davis sponsoring a student. So that's not giving money to the administration or the buildings, whatever. That is sponsoring a student, right? That's an idea. That's what I, spend my nights awake thinking about, right? How can we undo some of what's happened here, right? If that could happen, that would be great. But endowments, I'll stop there.
Well, just very briefly, I think the problem with endowments is behind Rob's point is that endowments get used for special things. They get used to build special institutes. They don't get used for student education necessarily. That's not the primary benefit of them. I just want to make one other comment when you asked about strategy. Sociologists do think about strategy. I don't think about it as much as my colleagues, but I do think you have an issue that you need to confront. You need to decide what you're going to focus on in the 2 weeks ahead. Are you going to focus on this issue or that issue? Are you going to keep the pressure on concerning tuition? Or are you going to focus on Katehi resigning? Or are you going to focus on accountability or restructuring of the university in some democratic way? Those are the kinds of choices you face. And I think that you're going to get the maximum, you have this sort of moment of maximum visibility. This is not a choice for any of us to make, but I think that you need to think very carefully about what your choices are so that you can get the most out of this moment.
On the endowment thing, endowments are restricted by donors usually. I have a friend who's got an endowed chair at Stanford, and part of the endowment is he has to have the picture of the donor hanging in his office always. She died many years ago. And she endowed 3 chairs at the university, and they recently rediscovered this clause in the endowments. They went to the storehouse and found her portrait hanging. It had been stored away because people had forgotten, and they went back and hung them in the offices. That's a benign example of the kinds of things that go on, but people restrict endowments for the use by people from Butte County. They don't want anybody else to use it. There are all kinds of things that, in universities that run with endowments are typically private and small. USC let me put it this way. UCLA in a single year produces more bachelor's degrees than Stanford, USC, and Caltech combined. Okay, Yale, it's 5,000 undergraduates. Harvard, it's not that much bigger. These places are tiny. And the idea that you can run a mass education system with private endowments as your primary source of funding, I think would be a fantasy. Not that that's what the chancellor's saying, but there are limits to what we can do, that kind of thing. The last thing I just wanted to mention about student loans, they've set that up now so that you cannot bankrupt out of student loan debt. You can go bankrupt and you still owe them the money. Okay? If you go under, most of those loans are guaranteed by the federal government. So they will get their money no matter what. And I know a lot of people who've had to deal with serious student loan debt and being unable to pay it. And let me tell you, those banks are really friendly when they want you to sign on that dotted line to take the loan. They're great. When it comes to collecting it, they are not friendly. And it is not a good place to be. And there are a lot of people who are heading that way, and there'll be a lot more if the university continues to get privatized.
Well, I want to thank all of our speakers, and I especially want to thank our audience for your seriousness, for your ability to stay through all of these talks and ask such intelligent, thoughtful questions. And good luck to everybody.